Hey, everybody. I'm Marianne Mohnraj. I'm here with Benjamin Rosenbaum for the Marianne and Ben Show. We're not calling it that anymore. Mohnraj and Rosenbaum are humans. so, and we're here with our guest, Jed Hartman, former
Hello.
senior fiction editor at Strange Horizons, current editor-in-chief is at Constellation Press. Is that your title?
I've been trying to decide.
Okay. It could
Overlord.
Yes.
just be it could just be editor. It's kind of funny. I've been listening to the Fine Gardening podcast and they have two people in the podcast who it's called Let's Argue About Plants, and they argue. One of them is her title is senior editor and his title is editor, and it's many episodes, and he seems quite like snarky and difficult, and she's kind of like funny and charming and sweet, and I kept being like, wow, yeah, he's a really like for a junior person, he's really, I was getting a little irritated on her behalf. And then at some point they said, well, even though my title is editor, I'm actually the editor in chief of the magazine. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. She reports to him and he gets to be snarky and that's his thing. So you could just be, like there's a certain like, well, I'm editor and you should know what that means.
I've been trying to decide between editor-in-chief and publisher, but I think I'm going with editor-in-chief.
All right. All right. So today we were going to talk about editing. So this is all like super relevant. You guys should be impressed that I managed to tie
Yeah,
that in to
nice,
the
nice.
subject matter of
Oh, yeah.
the podcast today. And we're not entirely sure where this is going to go, but we're going to start with talking about kind of revising and sort of like editing as a writer. And then we may move from there into editing as editors or working with editors, et cetera, so on. And I've now talked a lot, so I'm going to turn it over to Ben. And Ben, I'm going to make you start.
Mm,
And maybe if you could talk a little bit about your revision process, right? So when you've drafted something, it's beautiful, it's glorious, it's
huh.
okay.
Is it
or
now?
or you've drafted something and you think it's horrible, but regardless, so you're now going back in. What's that process like for you?
Well, I do have a theory. I mean, when you say it's horrible or it's glorious, that's also my first like little favorite speech, little canned piece of thing that I've has occurred to me before, and I will now declare again is I have this. So if you've already heard this in a con lobby, feel free to fast forward 10 seconds or 100,000 seconds. So I have often the experience that when I first write something, I'm really excited about it. Like not every day. Sometimes it's grueling, and you're like, oh God, I'm just like throwing words there. Probably I would be well served by writing more when I think writing sucks and I just and forcing myself through it. Possibly, I would be good to get to develop that stamina. But a
I
lot of
don't.
times I'm
I'll say when I do that, it tends to be crap.
yeah,
So
does
like
it?
like
Okay.
I've
Well then,
tried doing that. I've been like I need to like force myself to get the words out and develop that discipline, and the words are bad. They are notably worse than my normal words.
I'm
So
sure that would be true. I also have an admiration for people who like came from journalism and who were like 500 words by 4 o'clock today, go, or like 1,000,
Yeah.
5,000 words by 4 o'clock
no,
today, or whatever.
but there's a difference. There's a difference. So like, okay, so let's say I've got like, because I've written stuff on deadline where I had to get like 40,000 words out, 60,000 words out in a short period of time,
Mm-hmm.
and injured my hands in the
Yes, you
process.
destroyed your hands on.
Yeah. So there's a
Uh,
so there's like there's a kind of grind where you're like you're sitting at the computer, you're hating it, but you have to get the words out anyway. So you like make them, you just write something even though you know it's bad. For me, that that doesn't, that's a waste of time essentially,
yeah,
right? I can write something, and at this point it's probably even publishable, but I'm never going to be happy about it, right? It's going to
yeah, yeah,
be, less than what I can do.
yeah,
But
yeah.
if I'm like, I need to churn out 3,000 words today, and I am going to set up the conditions and environment that will facilitate me
Sure.
being in the right headspace to write well,
Hmm.
that often works fine, not
Yeah.
always, right? And so
No, I'm
I
I'm
just
with
think
you on that.
Like that's an
Yeah, no,
important
I agree.
distinction.
That is an important distinction. I stand corrected, and indeed, most of the time that people are good at writing a whole bunch of words on a tight deadline, it's probably because they can facilitate the condition to be in a good space to do that. I do think that there's also a pushing through. Like, there's also the experience that, like, I absolutely hate this now, but in 5 minutes, if I keep going, I will no longer. Because it depends. Because if I'm objectively looking at the work with some clarity and being like, this is going all astray, then there's no point in pushing through because it's just getting worse, right? But if it's more like I'm beset by doubts and insecurities that I can't actually see the text because I'm like, oh God, what am I doing? Why did I even go down this road? What am I thinking? Is this going to work? Like, I have my own fears and anxieties that are really about the future. They're not about what's happening in the present necessarily. Then if I push through, sometimes I get distracted. The very act of writing distracts me from all of the self-doubt or fears, and I start attending to the text, and then I'm like forgetting that I worry about things, and I'm just like in the text, and then it's fine. You know what I mean? And then maybe I emerge 20 minutes later, and I'm like, oh, actually, I'm kind of on a roll now. You know what I mean? So like some of that pushing through is actually really, it isn't
Well,
just slog forever. It's more like getting through the resistance.
and I will say that there's like the pushing through when the work itself is frightening, right? Like, so
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
Dorothy Allison has a great bit in her book of essays, Skin, talking about sex, class, and literature. There's one essay where she talks about how the best writing comes when you're terrified and you write it anyway.
Yeah.
And it always makes you think. There was this essay I wrote for the anthology Sex and Single Girls that was about talking during sex. And I was sitting in a cafe in Salt Lake City with my boyfriend at the time. And it was a good thing he was there because what I was writing was so, breaking taboo, self-revelatory, kind of scary for me personally to write, that
Mm-hmm.
I would write for 45 minutes. I'd write a scene of it, and then I would be shaking.
Yeah.
I was like, and I would get up, I'd put on my coat, I'd go for a walk around the snowy
Mm-hmm.
Salt Lake
Mm-hmm.
City block, sort of recover myself, and he could watch the computer while I did that,
Hmm.
and then I'd sit down, right, that's why he needed to be there. He needed to be there to
That
watch
was
the
sort of a
computer.
twist because I figured
It
he needed
was.
emotional support, or because no,
Exactly.
literally anybody. You could have just hired somebody to watch the computer. Okay.
Well, I'd hold the table,
Shout
right?
out
I mean,
to Marianne's old boyfriend.
when we're not in a pandemic, a cafe table is an important resource for a writer, right? So he was there occupying the table because I sat there. I think it took me like 5 or 6 hours to write this, and I had to get up every hour and walk around the square and like recover
Sure.
myself.
Sure.
So anyway, that's a little bit of a side tangent, but it's also
Probably could have just
funny
asked the
story.
barista, but
No, they
take
won't
a
hold the
look.
table for you
Oh, okay.
for like 6 hours. No, it's you have to keep ordering food. You have to,
Sure.
anyway.
Yeah.
So
I think that falls into the general category. That's a really interesting story. I had not heard that before. I think it falls into the general category that you mentioned of creating the conditions. And I think that's a really important thing because I know a lot of writers who I think generally beginning writers who feel that they cannot write until the muse visits them. And so they don't do a lot of writing because it's only when they feel inspired.
Yeah.
And I think that the idea that you can create conditions that will help you feel inspired is a really useful paradigm.
And I think there's a kind of classic sequence that people go through, right? When they're young writers or new writers, whatever age, they're like you say, they're like, they write when they feel inspired. At some point, many of us are like, I'm going to try and make a profession of this, and I'm going to be disciplined, and I'm going to try and kind of work through it. So there's often a sequence, right, where you're new to the arts, really whatever art. I see this with my daughter with illustration work, right? She likes to draw, and she draws when she feels inspired,
Yeah.
and doesn't otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so with writing, people do that. At some point, they're like, I want to try and make a profession of this. And then they will often kind of slip into the like grind it out.
Yeah.
And I think that's really dangerous because you can kill your joy in writing that way, right?
Yeah.
You forget why you came to this in the first place. But if you make it through that, there comes to the create the conditions bit where you realize like, no, I need the muse to visit me, and I need to make a space for the muse to visit me, and the muse will visit me if I do this right, like maybe
Here,
not
musey,
every
musey, musey.
time. Yeah, maybe not every time, but mostly, right? I'm fairly I don't know, you develop a trust in your subconscious, I guess, is really what it is, right?
Yeah, and I think I like that before we get to editing, we're now on first drafting and like conjuring the muse.
Yeah.
We did skip that otherwise, but because I do, maybe we've talked about it before, I don't know. But the one thing that is interesting that I think as a young writer, when you're like that thing you're talking about like just when I'm inspired versus I'll slog through it, and inviting the muse, you can feel a little helpless because you're like, why, how can I get, like, how will I know if the muse is here? How can I try? But the thing is that there's a distinction between a lot of what stops me, even now, but particularly then, was feeling like it's not good enough.
Yeah.
Linda Barry has a great comic I may have mentioned before.
Mm.
There's a great, I think it was in the McSweeney's comics issue. There's a little comic piece by Linda Barry in which about when you're a little kid and you're drawing all this fantastic stuff, and then somebody says that's good, and then from the moment that somebody praises your thing that you did, you have this little guy sitting on your shoulder going, is it good? Is it good? Is it good?
Yeah.
And then at some
Yeah.
point, somebody has a negative reaction where they're shocked that you drew something in the comic. They're shocked that you drew something unintentionally risque, and they're mad. And then they're like, she's like, it sucks. And then from then on, you've got these people on your shoulder like, is it good? Does it suck? Is it good? Does it suck? And everything you do, it's like very difficult to achieve this open, playful, creative space because you're constantly like evaluating. And there's a distinction between being like, I am slogging through in the sense that I am doing things I'm not inspired by or engaged with, versus I am slogging through in the sense that I am enduring the pain of the uncertainty that this is any good. Those are
Right.
different.
Right.
And the first is probably a waste of time, but the second is like sometimes it's torture because it's actually not that you're not engaged. It's actually
Right.
not that there's not a connection. You just don't feel any certainty that it's going to be praised later. You know what I
Well,
mean? Like you don't feel any certainty that you won't hate it later, or you won't be a waste of your time, or it won't be,
and also it, like, you can see the seams and you can see the clunkiness,
Yeah.
and that's painful, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I think I've mentioned this Ira Glass quote before, and it's a little long, so I'll tell people to go take a look for, if you look for Ira Glass quote on taste, he talks about how if you when you have good taste, you know what it should look like, and there's a gap between that and your skill level, right? And that gap is very, very painful.
Yeah.
I think about piano. I played classical piano for many years because I'm Sri Lankan and I had no choice in the matter, right? And so I had,
Child of immigrants.
yeah, right. So I had a stretch when I was like in 8th grade where I was practicing 2 hours of piano, 1 hour of flute, and 1 hour of Bharatanatyam every day after school, in addition to homework. That was my life. And so there's that, when you start working on a new piece, you make so many mistakes, right? And there's, your fingers haven't learned the phrase, there's some Rachmaninoff thing that's got, gazillion little trills in it and whatever, and you're like, I'll never be able to do this, or I've got to play, I don't know, 3 against 4, and who came up with this madness? But you just keep doing it and you get better, right? And eventually you're like, 3 against 4, no problem, right? Like, I got this. I know Jed's been learning how to play piano, so
I have been going through exactly that, although not with 3 against 4 yet.
Yeah, it'll come. So, I mean, I think I was about 10 years in before that, so maybe a little while. But yeah, there's this. It's this, and I feel like with writing, it's things like when you start doing like shifting points of view, or you're, like, there are these things that are mechanically a little bit difficult, and you don't have the skills. You've seen someone do it brilliantly. Your attempt looks like crap, and it's very easy to give up.
Painful.
Yeah, it's very easy to give up at that point. And I think so there, I would say pushing through is important, right? Like, and it's, I saw someone had a metaphor once that, like, writing was like seeing this, you have this image of this beautiful bird, right, flying through the air, and so you grab it and you pin it to the page, right, and then you pick up the sheet of paper with this bloody dying bird on it, and you show it to people saying, look, it's
look
a bird.
Beautiful.
Look at my beautiful bird.
Look how beautiful it is flying through the air. Yes. Now that I've killed it.
Nice.
Yeah. That painfulness of the gap, and the so a lot of times, like on the one hand, like engagement is the thing to go after, and not like certainty, or not like quality, or not like that's actually hugely distracting to be like, is this good? You know what I mean?
Right.
Is it like, am I on a roll, or does this connect, or is this going somewhere, is a different question than like, is it good? Because first of all, in a first draft, it's totally okay if it's crap. Like, that's
Yeah.
not the job of the first draft to be good in the first place. It's the job of the first draft is to have something there. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? You'd rather have a first draft that's like, this is full of holes and it's a mess, but there's something there. That's better than like, well, this is extremely well crafted and I'm not particularly interested in it. You know what I mean? Like, that was a way better outcome, the first one, for a
It
first draft.
is, like that's something I really struggle with still because
Mm-hmm.
like I know that's true. I tell my students that. I agree with it. However, I have had I've had quite a few first drafts that were publishable, right?
Mm-hmm.
That were
Sure.
good. They, the muse visited, whatever. I was in the
Yeah.
zone
Sure.
and
Sure.
they
Yeah.
came out, very clean. And I
Yeah.
did like a light polishing edit and sent it off and it got
Sure.
published.
It's not
So,
bad if it's already good.
no,
That's
no,
okay. It's forgivable. I'm just saying it's not necessary.
it's sort of like the bright kid problem, right? Like if
Yeah.
you have like
Right.
early success with that kind of
Right.
thing,
Right. Right.
um,
It feels like it should always be that way.
it feels like it should always be that way, and you never learn to work,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there comes a point where your ambitions have increased. You're trying to do
Mm-hmm.
harder things. You
Mm-hmm.
can't just dash off some
Mm-hmm.
brilliant version of it,
Yeah.
right? So when I first started to write book length works, and I could no longer hold the whole project in my head. I used to
Yeah.
write very short, right? Like when
Yeah.
I said I wrote
Right there with you.
these things that were publishable, they were also often like 1,000
Yep.
words. Like I wrote
Yeah.
these very tiny
Yep.
little things. And so as they got bigger and more complicated, they had more flaws. And
Yeah.
I have to give a shout out here to Jen Reese, whose novel A Game of Fox and Squirrels, most recent novel, came out recently, and it's brilliant YA, recommend to everyone.
Agreed.
But I was talking on Facebook about some issue I had, and Jen, who is someone I know from Strange Horizons Publishing and conventions for many years, a writer colleague, I'd say, and a kind of casual friend. We don't know each other well, but she came into this Facebook discussion and said, "Marianne, you never learned how to revise.
Mm.
That's your problem. Your
Mm-hmm.
problem is that if it's not good on the first draft, you give up and go work on something else." And maybe the ADD plays into this a little bit
Mm-hmm.
too, right? Like if you can do other things easily and they come out well, you're
Mm-hmm.
disincentivized from
Mm-hmm.
working on the hard thing.
Yeah.
And that is, and my husband's a mathematician, and he and I had a similar conversation around the same time where he's like, "You never actually work at anything."
Mm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, "I'm working all the time, but I'm not in the sense he meant,"
Yeah.
right? Where he will spend months, if not years, on some theoretical topology problem, geometry problem that I don't understand anything he does, but he'll work on it and think about it and go down blind alleys and make wrong turns over and over and over again. And that's the process. And like after 9 months, he's like, okay, I can cross off this whole avenue of research as unfruitful, and
Huh.
I'm going to count that as progress.
Right.
And I'm like, oh
Right.
my
Right.
God, that's so depressing.
Sure.
How do you
Sure.
like get up the next day and keep working, right? But that's
Yeah.
just what it is to be a mathematician. And I suspect like, a cancer researcher or whatever, right? Like it's built into the process. I know, I'm sorry, I'm babbling, but like this is something I have a really hard time with. So and I've gotten better, I hope, in the last year or two at sitting with my failures.
So I want to add two things to that. One is that I think that's really interesting because Marianne, I think that you are one of the best people I know at taking a draft that is perfectly good and turning it into something amazing in revision. I've seen you do it multiple times, and I'm always impressed by it. So that
but I
that
don't
maybe
want to. I don't want to do the work. Like I
Sure.
get avoidant about it. Anyway, go on.
The other thing was just a minor side note that I wanted to note that Jen's novel is, I believe, middle grade rather than YA.
Oh, yeah.
And that I think that it should have a content warning for abuse and the aftermath of abuse.
Yep.
But I agree that it is brilliant.
Yep. So, okay, sorry, I went off on a long thing, Ben. So
No, that's a good thing. It's a good thing, and I think it's very germane. And like and in a way, I'm very similar. Like short stuff is easy, and then it's a point where all of a sudden it gets hard. And I mean, where but one thing that gets hard is the not being able to hold the whole story in your head. I mean, and also just there are some days where it's like you have a fugue state where you write everything and it basically is done, and then other things that are like little scraps and pieces. And when I gave up writing when I was young, it was precisely because I was a story we've told before. Because I could not learn how to revise. Like I could not how to
Mm.
learn how to, and emotionally, it wasn't that I couldn't figure it. I mean, I was missing some skills, but most of it was emotional. Like, could not learn to face and be with the gap between what I had actually written and what I wanted it to be, and like endure being in that gap long enough to tweak things and try things out and gradually experiment my way from what I had
Yeah.
actually done closer to what I wanted it to be, and also to let it evolve in that process to maybe not be the bird in flight that I had originally envisioned, but some other thing that it was going to be that I would, to have the humility to like be willing to go with it on its journey to where it was going to be. You know what I mean? To some
Yeah.
compromise between what I wanted and what it wanted. And part of that was I needed to require emotional resilience. And in fact, as I've told the story, like I left writing for 10 years and came back, partly because I just needed enough of the rest of my life to have enough substance to it that I had something to
Mm.
fall back on emotionally to endure like confronting failure. Like, you know what I mean? To confronting like having
Yeah.
trying something, having it not work and being like, okay, I'm not going to die because of this. Like worst case, this writing thing is not going to work out, but like, I'm not going to
Yeah.
die, I'm
Right.
not going to be, or worse than die. I'm not going to, my life will not have had any purpose. You know what I mean? Because I think when I was
Well,
18 or something, I felt like, well, if I can't be a great writer, there will be all a waste, everything. I was very dramatic. And like at 25, 27, 20, 30, I was like, well, I got a nice life
there's
regardless.
you're making me think about there's a moment of shift from external motivators to internal motivators that also needs to
Mm,
happen, right?
mm,
So with my students,
mm-hmm.
my college students, they're in a class, they have deadlines, they're getting course credit. I think this is often true for young athletes, young musicians, young dancers. Like, even if they love the thing, they also have school and parents pushing at them, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes pushing very hard. I cite my own tiger mom in this, right? So, like, when that won't sustain you forever. There
Mm-hmm.
comes a point,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm not an athlete, so maybe in sports, maybe it's a short enough timeline that all the what I mean. Like, you can't,
Right, if
like,
you're successful enough, if you stay on that track,
yeah,
particularly
like there,
in
well,
sports,
so
probably.
yeah, like there is maybe there, but at least in writing, it's a long road. It's and it's a road with a lot of dips in it, and it's not. I mean,
And early
almost no.
success can actually be quite dangerous in a way.
You're right, right. There's the first novel problem, etc. Right, like I think a lot of my students come in hoping to be wunderkind, right?
Yeah.
They're going to write
Right.
the great American novel and blow everybody away, and I think the publishing industry kind of feeds into that, right?
Sure.
They're like, let me bring
Yeah.
out this fabulous 20 something debut person. We've had
Yeah.
a, bidding war for them and paid $3 million for a short story collection. And they have now been anointed as the next great thing. And, that must be super fun, except that A, it happens to almost no one. And B, like, you can't bet on building a career that way.
Mm-hmm.
And B, it's crushing, right?
Yeah.
Like, in terms of what do you do for your next trick, right?
Yeah.
Like, even
Yeah.
if you pull that off once. So there is I think I hate to say maturity. Like, I feel like when young people hear me say you have to develop maturity, they get really cranky, right?
Well, for
Like,
one thing, because the word sounds like there's really nothing they can do except wait 20 years. You know what I mean?
right. And that's
Like
not, yeah.
yeah,
Right.
that's
That's
not quite
that's not what I
true.
mean. That's
It's not
not,
quite
yeah, right.
true. I think
It's
it's resilience in some ways.
it's
It's
resilient. I mean,
resilience part of it.
but I guess where I say
Perspective.
maturity in the sense of developing some understandings of the supports maybe that you'll need to get through and what the process looks like. Like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking about exercise. Periodically, I get motivated to exercise.
Mm.
I will start running or lifting weights or whatever else. And there's at this point, I've done this enough that there's a very predictable pattern, which is
Mm-hmm.
I will have 3 days of being really enthused about it. And I will if I'm not careful, what I used to do is I would overdo at that point, right? And I would like work out really hard. And then day 4, I would feel ill and I used to quit, right?
Mhm.
Like I would
Mhm.
just stop again. And then months would go by and then I'd repeat the pattern. And at
Yeah.
some point, I figured out like, hey, if I don't overdo in the first 3 days,
Yeah.
if I make a schedule and a plan and I kind of stick to like tiny increments of I'm going to lift the weights, 2 additional reps next time, I can build strength and endurance and whatever at a sustainable rate.
Mhm.
And I think that's it's a very human problem. I think people run into this with, I don't know, like in every aspect of their lives, right?
Sure.
And so anyway, so you can take that metaphor and apply it to writing as well, hopefully in some useful manner.
I have
So,
I have two thoughts. One that's sort of related to that, and one going back to an earlier subtopic. The sort of related part is that I wanted to recommend the book Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, which
beautiful.
is one of the few books about how to write that has ever been useful to me. And part of it is the idea of taking things slowly, although not quite in the same sense that you're talking about. The other thing that I wanted to say is sort of a general meta note about this whole conversation, which is that I think it's important to note that different people have different processes.
Yeah.
And often, when writers ask questions, when at a convention panel, a writer will stand up and ask the famous writer on the panel, so what is your process? And I think that sometimes the question really is, what magical process can I use that will make me into as good a writer as you, or as best-selling writer as you, or whatever? I think that it sometimes takes a while to learn that that's not useful, that sometimes you can get great ideas about process. Sometimes you can learn a process from hearing other people talk about it, but that nobody should take this as the correct process that
Yes.
is the right one for you.
I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with standing up at the panel because you might luck out and get the person who's you know what I mean? You might
Sure.
luck out and find someone very like you, but I do
Yeah.
think that
Nothing wrong with asking.
there's a
Yeah.
hugely dangerous pitfall where the person says, "Oh, I plan everything out on index cards," and then you try that for 5 years and make yourself miserable and feel like you're a
Yes.
failure because you can't. And because that's a well-known example is pantsers and plotters, but like there's so many things which are well, I have to write in a completely closed room with no distractions. But then some people are the opposite, right? Like, so, I'm the opposite. I was giving I have to have distractions.
I'm reminded of. Have you guys read Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke?
No.
I've heard the title, but I haven't read it.
Oh, you both have to go read the first Letter to a Young Poet.
Oh, wait, I guess I have.
It's a short collection, and in the first one, he's writing. Rilke, brilliant poet, is writing back to this young person who's asked for advice and saying, basically ignore everything.
Yeah.
Resist the urge to show your work to other people. Just
Yeah.
just go deep into it, and it's so hard to kind of hear that internal voice. It's going to get drowned out by the world.
Yeah.
So I always, so much of my life as an academic who teaches writing and so on is about giving feedback. When we finish the podcast today, I have to go and read some of my student stories and write them critique. And I hope I'll be able to give them something useful, but there's a little part of me that's always thinking of the Rilke and thinking like, maybe it would be better if they were just off on their own and ignoring everything. So
and that really, that having, but it's a dance between feedback and space, between like community and, but and it can be dramatically different for different people. And actually, I used to be very amazed by you, Marianne, because you would literally like write 1,000 words first draft and like send it to 30 people and get immediate feedback. And I was like, I could not possibly function like that. I would be so confused, and either like, it doesn't matter what they said. If they were all like, this is great, this is amazing, I would get like really like hung up on making them feel that way the next time too. And if they were like, this is terrible, I'd be motivated. And if they had suggestions, I don't know,
okay,
it's just very overwhelming.
So you and I, all three of us went to Clarion. So I have to say, I think I picked that up after Clarion.
Yeah.
And I think Clarion is what made it possible for me to do it usefully. So just to sidetrack there for a minute. So at Clarion, science fiction, fantasy writing workshops. Typically, there are about 17 of you in this 6-week intensive workshop, and you write a story a week and get it critiqued by this group of 16, 17 people. At my Clarion, someone early on, maybe Michael Bishop or Delaney, one of the early instructors told us, you're going to go around the room, you're going to hear 16 different opinions. If you hear something 3 times, that is an indicator that this is something that is enough people are stumbling on that you should probably look at it again, right? Like if you hear a problem 3 times, also if you hear a good thing 3 times, that's a good sign. But for the problems, and they also told us that those people are also writers. They may suggest solutions, but those might be the solutions for them. It's not necessarily the solution for you. But it's just a go back and look at this moment. So I still do this. I draft something and I'll post on Facebook and I'll ask for beta readers, and I love getting new beta readers too. So I'll often have like a new set of 10 to 30 people looking at a story, and they'll all read it and come back to me with a paragraph or a page of feedback. And what I'm looking for, it's like sifting, right? You're sifting for the common things that are rising to the surface with this variety of opinions, and most of it drops away, right?
So you're talking about a different thing than I'm talking about. I think that's a good discussion to have, and I'm very with you on that, and that's worth talking about. But I know that. Like I'm good at at the time that you're talking now about the activity of like, here are many opinions. How do you find out which ones are useful for your work? That was a hard lesson to learn. We should have a segment on that either this time or the next time. That's very useful. I would slightly disagree with how you framed it, although I think it's worth. But before we go into the like, how do you decide which feedback is the right feedback to apply to your work, which is an important point, I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about sort of before getting to that point. I'm talking about like I'm pretty extroverted, but you are way more extroverted than me. I think you could just it's sort of like you just thrive emotionally on the fact that everybody is paying attention and telling you things.
I'm a Leo. I love
in your brain, you could then, if you were at an earlier stage in your career, you could get confused and apply too many of the things, or if you were at a later stage in your career, you could know which things to pick. But just on like the emotional level, before we get to the intellectual process of deciding which input is the right input, it's just like that is going to nourish you.
Yeah.
Right? When I say it's confusing, I don't mean it's confusing because I can't tell which suggestions are relevant to the project of the work, because at this stage in my career I can. I'm just saying, like, I probably won't predictably finish the thing if I show it to everybody before it's done, because of that Rilke moment of like being alone with just the silence of your own voice and listening to your own thing. Like, I think that as much as you relate to the Rilke thing, and as much as you see that as a cautionary tale for your own teaching, like that you might be depriving your students at that moment, I also think that in you, that's pretty resilient. Like in you, that inner voice is not necessarily stifled by it being in the middle of a party. You know what I mean? Like, like because I don't think it says, you know what I mean? You just.
It must be stifled by one strong voice telling you something, but not by being in the middle of a party.
I'm sort of reminded that, I always think that my mother and I used to get into these brutal arguments, and we're both incredibly stubborn, right? And so like so I think that may be it. Like there's a fundamental core of I'm quite sure I'm right? And whether I'm actually right or not, I'm sure enough that I don't get drowned out by the.
And I think partly, I mean, I'm reasonably confident that I'm reasonably. I mean, we're somewhat similar in that regard. I think that while I am confident in my opinions, I'm also very much an accommodator. Like I'm very much like in the family constellation, the one who is like, my dad and sister have locked each other into the room after a screaming fight, and I'm knocking on the doors being like, he's sorry, she's sorry, come out now. You know what I mean? Like that.
You're not the oldest child?
No, I am the oldest child. I am the oldest child.
That's unusual to be the accommodator.
I know. Well, it isn't. Like,
I mean, is the rebel typically. No?
Well, I mean, I don't want to throw my parents. I don't want to throw my parents under the bus here. But, lovely parents, and I have a very good relationship with them. But I think, but it was a turbulent time in their marriage when I was young, and when my sister was born, I think there was really
Yeah.
at the breaking point. I think that if you are in a my daughter, my oldest child, is certainly very confrontational and in your face, but I think she grew up in a very
Stable.
safe family constellation where she wasn't going to break anything by railing against it. Like we were solid,
Mm,
and she had plenty of room to be the
yeah.
outspoken rebel. And I think I was in, like, even as a little kid, was in kind of emergency control mode. But like I don't think that 3-year-old me was wrong in the
Huh.
evaluation that by
Yeah.
being like a perfect older brother and calming everybody down, I would actually increase this household's chances of remaining a single household. I
Right.
think I was a good call by 3-year-old me. Anyway, so so yes, that's a footnote to the older parent. I mean, I do it in a very
So,
older
so,
brother
so
way, but
what we're
so
saying overall here, tell me, this is what I'm hearing is that to be a good writer, you must first go to therapy and figure out your
no, I don't know
issues.
about that. I don't know about that.
No.
No, the reason is we were talking about why for you it's totally fine for 100 people to give you suggestions on the first
No,
1,000
no, no.
words. You like to say like
I'm
10,000
joking,
words.
but I'm also serious. I'm like you, you know, like to do your work well, you have to know how you work, right? You have
Yes, I
to,
think that's
right,
true. I think that's true. I
right.
think in some ways, I mean, I think I'm not going to dissuade anybody from going to therapy. Therapy's great if you have the resources to do it, and if you don't, there are
Peer-to-peer therapy
yeah,
thing.
if there's
Yeah,
peer therapy things, and it's not like therapy is great and really important, and also we shouldn't make it magic. Like therapists
yeah,
are trained, and that's really good, and that's great. But like, it's not like, oh, I can't afford therapy, therefore there's no way. Like like
yeah,
clearly, like there was friendship and talking to people about things before there was therapy, right? And
right.
so and writing in itself, I feel like is a kind of can be a kind of therapeutic introspection. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
and like facing yourself and there's also something. I mean, obviously, some writers manage to be complete, like, unself-examined assholes, even after writing a
Indeed.
lot of words. So I'm not trying to propose that it's some kind of ensured process, but there is something available in like
hmm
facing your fear and then capturing it in marks on paper that endure beyond the moment when you had the thought, and then being able to go revisit them in another moment and being confronted with what you thought then while you're thinking now about what you thought then, which has like a real power of coming to understand.
Hey there, humans, and others who may be listening. I just wanted to wish all our audience a Happy New Year and to remind you all about the organization that has made this podcast possible in the first place. The Speculative Literature Foundation, or the SLF for short, is a nonprofit 501c3 organization that strives for equal access to great and advanced science fiction, fantasy, and horror literature. It's a new year, so we have some plans for 2022. We're going to be revamping our website, we're going to expand the Portland project, which means more interviews and more educational modules. Also, we will continue to give out grants like the AC BOSI grant, Older Writers Grant, Diverse Writers Grant, Working Class Writers Grant, and more. For more information about grants, the other exciting things we have going on at the SLF, and how you can support it all as a member, please visit www.speclit.org. Thanks.
It's not about not being an asshole, right? I mean, it's about it's about the, you know, we talk about voice, and you know, I often have young writers who are very anxious about like developing their voice, and you know, do I have, you know, they worry about being imitative, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting that in writing you see this anxiety a lot. Anxiety of influence, right,
Yeah.
is the phrase that I'm going to write a bad copy of Tolkien, or I'm going to write a bad, you know, I feel
Mhm.
like in genre, people don't worry about it as much, even if
Yeah.
they
Yeah. That
maybe do
seems
it
like a
more.
literary
But,
writing obsession
but,
in some
but
ways.
well, I feel like they should worry about it a little bit anyway, but in literary writing,
I
they
don't
worry
know.
about it a lot. And I think it's interesting because in visual arts,
Yeah.
being imitative is part of the process. You
Yeah.
are supposed to
Sure.
go to the Art Institute, set up your little
Yeah.
easel and sketch, right? And copy the masters. And I'm always reminded of Ben Franklin, who in his autobiography talks about he wanted to be a great man, and great men give great speeches. And so when he was a teenager,
Yeah.
he would like sit in the barn where I mean, like he was working all these jobs as a printer's apprentice, whatever, but he would sit in the barn copying out
Mm-hmm.
great speeches by, Plato, Socrates, whatever, to get the rhythms into his head. And I was like, who does that? But, Ben
Mm.
Franklin does that apparently. And I think that's fascinating
And
because
more
it's
people
not,
should do it. I mean,
and more people should do it. Like,
I
it's
don't have
not
that
how
much
we typically
patience.
teach,
I
right?
don't have,
Like,
well, I mean, consider it. I don't have that much patience with the anxiety of influence. Like in some ways, I think that's part of the whole modern, we still have this hangover of modernism, of like this elevation of originality, and it's very much this, and it's kind of, there's something very toxic and very patriarchy-ish about it, about the like the lone genius who the muse speaks to and who is untrammeled by, and it's like it's kind of anti-community, and it's kind of like, and I mean that's what really knifed me in the back when I was a teenager, I think, was this kind of
mm,
thinking, and this and it's so inhumane compared to the idea that compared to a more pre-modern idea of the arts, where you are an apprentice who is doing simple things, and then you're doing slightly more complicated things, and you're doing what the other people do because they taught you how to do those things, and you know what I mean, you're not, how are you supposed to spring from the brow of Zeus? Like yes, completely take your favorite writer and like do a rip off of them. Please write some, you know what I mean? Like I think today's kids are less beset by this because they're
Yeah.
writing fan fiction.
Yeah.
And
right.
that's a really like workman like,
Yeah.
that's lovely, a lovely response to modernism, is to be like, I will now go just write more words by my favorite authors that they didn't get around to writing. Is in a way that's very much the antidote to this, like I have to be this completely separate thing cut off from all the rest of the world that's valued for its own pure originality.
And I think that once in a while you do get somebody who can do that amazing cut off from the world, come back with something amazing. But I keep saying amazing. But I think that you often are missing out on the conversation if you go off and you try to write the great science fiction novel without having read any science fiction. Then you're likely to, as many writers have, end up recreating tropes and approaches that the genre moved past decades ago.
I mean, I
Yeah,
feel like there's a corrective to that too. That is something which is often said, and sure, we have that, yes. And I have that experience too, reading people who, there's a little bit of the true fan reaction when somebody comes in as a tourist from outside the genre,
Yes, it's
and they
true.
don't.
It's true.
But there's also a way in which it is. I think the thing important is connections. I don't think anybody is their own like monolith speaking to the muse. Like even when we find somebody we think they are, they probably are just drawing different sources of inspiration and community that we're
Fair
not
enough.
used to, and that's great.
I want to push back a little though,
Yeah.
because I'm not. So a couple of things. One, what Jed was saying, I feel like that's important. It's kind of leading me in a different direction. I'm thinking about things like, I was just on a panel yesterday with Iona Sharma, I haven't run across her work before, but she is a South Asian writer writing about sentient ships, and we were talking before the panel, and I was like, oh, it's so like reminiscent of Anne McCaffrey and The Ship Who Sang, and she's like, oh yeah, people have said that to me. I haven't read it, and I was like, and I thought it was fascinating. She had sort of like, inherited this tradition without reading the original, and she's writing some beautiful stuff, and I really recommend. What was it? 13 something not for navigation. I'm blanking exactly on her title, but we'll find it. But the kind of problem Jed's talking about, I do see a lot in things like when I was reading for the Salam Award in Pakistan, and these short story writers, many of the stories I read were, to me, read like 70s, 60s, 70s Asimov's analog fiction. And I could sort of tell, like, this is what they have in the bookstores there. This is what
Yeah.
they have as models.
Sure.
And so they're doing a good job with it. No one in America is going to publish it right at this point because the conversation has, I don't even want to say evolved, but it's moved. It's shifted elsewhere. And the interesting thing is, now that Strange Horizons and Clark's World and so on are all online, there's a potential for access. And what I would predict is that in the next decade, those writers are going to devour the contemporary scene in America and Europe, and then we'll have a much accelerated pace of literary evolution in spec fic. And so we're going to see some really fascinating things coming out of that. Anyway, but that was all a side note, because what I really wanted to say was I wanted to argue with Ben, which, because I think those community things that you're talking about are important, but I do actually, I think there's something there to the individual voice, and I'm thinking about the authors whose work I most love at the moment are people like Samin Nosrat, who is in the food world, Roxane Gay. They're people who have a very, and these are more nonfiction people than fiction. So I'll put that out there. I mean, Roxanne does both. Samin is more nonfiction writer. She doesn't, I don't think, does fiction at all. But what comes through is their strong individual viewpoint,
Sure.
and that voice is. So I don't know, like that.
But I'm not saying, like, of course, that's obviously hugely valuable. The question is how you get there. I'm not saying that I don't I'm not saying everybody should be the same. I'm not saying that I don't value, but what I'm saying is, what I think is the toxic myth is the way to arrive at your strong individual voice is to go off into the garret and avoid the influence of others and fear, and you're describing your students to sort of strive after it. Like, I have to think of something, you know what I mean? And that's going to get you with something very thin and tenuous and shallow and constructed.
I agree.
And actually, I feel like being deeply rooted in your community and react particularly in a polyvalent community that has multiple sources, and to reacting to these things and recombining them and filtering them through your own experience and feeling, I think you're going to develop your individual voice when you feel, born up and nurtured by a community, and that you're not this separated, that it's an expression. And even the most individual voice is an expression of its world, right? And it's not like this, it's not like separated violently by the knife of individuality. It's individual because it's an expression of a particular node in the graph, but it partakes of everything around it.
It could be a negative reaction to the world around you too. It doesn't have to be borne up by community.
Yes.
But yes.
Well,
there is that interaction. There's a conversation going on.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean everything is all kumbaya and everybody loves everybody and it's all hugs. I mean but I also don't want to privilege. I don't want to privilege, like, I don't know, being in a, like, if you are running around burning things down, that's not less engaged. Nor do I want to throw under the bus writers who are go off to a cottage and live in the woods, if that's your thing. But
and bring their laundry home. Sorry, go on.
No, but I mean, like maybe you really are a person who stays away from other people. That's fine. I'm not saying loner, and I'm saying being a loner that could be great. Being a kooky, weird loner is fine. But but it's this aspirational thing. Where you are going to be the one, and where you are, separated from. I don't know. You know what I mean?
No, and there's a certain, I think what I see with my students is they're often kind of desperate to find their voice, and what I want to tell them is to put that aside, right? Like, try and quiet that anxiety, that tension, etc., and just do the work, right? Like, I mean, that's really, it's a little carry water, chop wood, right? It's if you engage in the discipline, if you're doing piano and you practice your scales enough, eventually you'll be able to play 3 against 4. And
that, I mean, there's a fine line there, because it also doesn't mean then of course when it comes to going and grading their work, you don't want to be. It's not that they should be punished for not being like everybody else, right?
We don't grade. Everyone gets an A. So.
Okay, but you know what I mean. If you're kind of like, there is a tension between saying connected to a community and saying, I don't want people to be doing homogenous things. In fact, my thesis is that they're more likely to do homogenous things if each of them thinks they're like a great lone
Right.
ingenious individual than if they're like in conversation. I actually think if they're in conversation and like connected, they're going to be like, ooh, you did that. Now I'm going to do this. And then it's going to be more diverse than if they're like, each one is like off in their, everybody being off in their garret is going to write the same Hemingway pastiche or whatever. You know what I mean? I don't know.
I feel like we have been flirting for on and off for the past hour or so with workshops, and I wonder if we want to just talk about workshops.
Well, before we do, I did want to say one thing about.
Okay.
I mean, if you just have something to say, but
we don't have to. We can do it another
topic.
time.
I have less to say about workshop, but I did want to circle back to the thing that I was originally going to say about first drafting and editing. Two things. Mm-hmm. One is that like we were sort of talking about how it's great when it just flows and how it's hard to, and how that's like a moment when you confront having to revise and having to be with the pain of the gap is hard, but also it's such a gift. Like that's the other thing I felt like I didn't finish that part, that's the counterbalancing thing, is that it is so amazing to have the chance to revise. Like it is such a gift that in many art forms you don't have, that you get to go back and think again and do it differently. And that there's a, this is a weird example, but I wrote this on my blog back when there was, do you remember the Amina imposter scandal thing? So very briefly, there was this purported queer, like woman, Syrian Arab blogger on the ground in Syria during the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, and was writing all these it was a very powerful writer, and everybody was sort of fascinated by her and telling these very dramatic stories about her, like coming out to her parents, and I don't know, like all this. It was very heartwarming and profound. And then she was like went silent in the middle of the Civil War, and people were like, "Oh my God, she's on the run." And there was even I think there was some drama in the story about how they were coming for her and whatever. And like literally, people called to the State Department and like tried to get them to intervene to maybe save this like dissident lesbian blogger who was on the run in Syria. Turned out it was a white Scottish guy who'd made the whole thing up, and which produced this outrage. And the interesting thing was, first of all, fuck you, because it's stolen authority. And there's also a way in which people were like, well, but it was really good and compelling and well written. And it's like, yes, he could think reasonably well about things, and he could stitch a phrase together. But instead of like having to stand on his own merits, and he literally said, like, I would post on these forums all my wise thoughts about the Middle East, and nobody would listen to me. And then when I instead said that I was a Syrian woman, all of a sudden, go figure, they all took my opinions, which were great opinions. Seriously, I mean, like, he thinks they're great opinions. And it's like, yes, that's because you just stole. That's because everybody has to assume when they're reading a thing, they have to judge it in context. And if you're like, if like Fauci, who's like a doctor at the CDC, says something, I'm like, oh, well, you're a doctor at the CDC. So I'm going to assume that those parts I don't specifically know about might be true. And if you're reporting on your lived experience, that's also true. If you're making it up, that it turns out. Okay.
Ben, you're going to get mad at me, but I'm a little bit on his side. So, yeah, no, there have been a couple cases like this. There was an Australian writer who was writing about arranged marriage stuff and like honor killings. There was a thing about that, and there was a book that came out that turned out they had no lived experience of this. And there was I think a Holocaust survivor who turned out not to be a Holocaust survivor. Who also, and in these various cases, and what's his name, who
the hoax.
There's the one with he was on the Oprah Winfrey show, Million Little Pieces, James Frey, right? Who didn't actually go to jail, but wrote about having gone to jail. And I guess I would make a distinction between James Frey and these other people, because the Syrian blogger I didn't look at in a lot of detail. The Australian case I was looking at a little more. I feel like those people were people who were trying to make political change. They were not necessarily in it for their writing career, and they chose a method that was morally questionable for what they saw as a greater goal. And I just feel like that's a different case than someone like James Frey, who's looking for literary glory and is now going to
okay, so I
right. So
personally know this guy was looking for a book deal because I literally he sent me the PDF so that I could hook him up with an agent.
Okay.
So that's not in question. But secondly, as Amina, he was looking for a book deal as his invented personality. But it's not that I don't have sympathy. I have enormous sympathy because I'm also a white guy, and I would love for people to just listen to my really great opinions as if, right? But there is something, and I'm not just talking about like always in it for the money or whatever. Yes, he also wanted political change. He thought his ideas about the Middle East were so good and that things would be better in the Middle East if people listened to him. And by the way, they weren't such bad ideas. Like the ideas by themselves. I was like, when Amina was writing it, I was like, I'm kind of on board with that. It's not about the content. It's the shortcut. And here's what I was originally coming back to say. He cheated himself.
Yeah, no,
I mean, he not only did he defraud everyone else, and by the way, squander the resources of actual people in this, endanger people's lives probably. But I'm not even talking about that. It's the immaturity to think I will take this shortcut. And I'm not talking about some clever literary hoax where you, which is where you're in on the joke all along. There have been hoaxes that were done on purpose to like expose things, and where the point was the discovery. A good hoax is where, when it's discovered, the authors of the hoax are like, see, get it? You see what I was going with there? You see, like when you publish some bullshit paper in some thing, and
I agree. I agree. We don't have to like. I really.
It's about revision. What I wanted to say, it's about revision. Coming back to revision. You can say something about it.
I got seduced by utilitarianism, and that's really like it's a separate political issue, and we'll put it aside.
He cheated himself because when he ended up sending this PDF of the. So I had like little tiny small part in this history because Amina sent me her PDF, and I was like, well, I know some people. I connected her with Minal and whatever, and I was, am I saying her name right? Minal? We were like, oh, maybe we can help you out. This is important. You have an important story to tell. First of all, what I'm saying is, by making his work immune to people questioning it, by people not being able to go, well, this isn't your lived experience. Do you know that this is true? Maybe you should check that up with people or whatever. Like, it had an air of like, well, I don't, that's her. Doesn't, I mean, it's unusual, but I mean, she's a real person and that's her life. So, okay, that's obviously happened. That made it not, there was a missed opportunity. And then the other thing is, there was a bit where people were like, after I ended up handing over this PDF and publishing the PDF, because I thought it was a matter of public record at this point. Like, the fact that this has happened was like, I'm not particularly going to privilege you getting your book deal over, I don't know, it might have helped his book deal if he was really going to have a book deal. But I was like, this is here. This is now in the public domain because you have made it a matter of public record by doing this. And people were like, oh, it's got all this Orientalist, creepy stuff in it, right? Like, there was a takedown of where people were writing about how like it was the white gaze of, but there's the thing, nothing in it was worse than things I've done in a first draft. I've definitely like the Unraveling, one of the very first drafts of the Unraveling, which you guys read, and which Megan McCarran tore me a new asshole about the gender issues. What a fucking gift, right? That she would do that, and that totally like 100% on about, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like, anyway, he missed that because he didn't do the work of being like, this is who I am, and I need to go to people who actually know about this. And had he actually made connection with queer Arabs like Amina, those would have been first draft problems, because he would have been able, if he couldn't have seen it himself, they could have told him if he had those relationships of trust. If people thought that you were worthwhile enough to invest in, which you've got to actually be doing as much for them as they're doing for you, by the way. Like, it's not like he had any right to that critique, to anybody's time. But had he done the work to earn, like, somebody being worth his while to do that, he would have been able to not just not get in trouble, but think better. He would have been able to learn and think better and write better, because it's an incredible gift, not for the first thing you blurt out of your mouth to be the thing that endures forever, but to be able to write something that is full of your unexamined biases and your bullshit and your personal limitations. And then, like, you look at it, your trusted friends look at it, and you can go back and literally be a better person about all those things in your third draft than you were in your first draft. That is a sacred gift.
So I have like 20 things I want to say in response. One of which, okay, I think we should probably put the Amina specifics aside, in part because I feel like, when we talk about community, I hadn't realized the extent to which you were personally involved in this. And there's coming across to
I was
me, there's
peripherally involved in it, but
well, it sounds like there was a clear sense of personal betrayal and a betrayal of trust and community connections and writers helping other writers.
But it wasn't me he was hurting. I mean, I was not a vulnerable person who was being hurt. It was
that
really
maybe, but you sound betrayed and angry. So
I'm angry, but not anyway. Yeah, but I mean,
not to say that others would not be more injured, but I think it's complicated, and this is, when anyone does this kind of literary hoax, this is, and I'm thinking there were early bloggers in the day who were revealed to be making everything up and so on, and you develop as a reader a relationship. You think you're in a relationship with a writer who turns out to be something else, and that can be very upsetting and hurtful. So
I think I was outraged on behalf of other people who had really hurt.
Sure, I don't think that invalidates my point, but
no, I'm not saying
that. But putting I kind of want to put all of that aside because I think it's a little bit getting in the way of the gift or revision idea, which is this is, I guess, where I connect back to maturity a little bit, because it's hard, I think, to get to a point of seeing that opportunity as a gift, right? When I write something, my first impulse is I want praise, right? That's what I want. That's all I want is praise. I want to put it out there and have everyone tell me it's fabulous. I want to take it to workshop or publish it and then get praise. So when that doesn't happen, it's frustrating, right? And that moment of frustration is, I think, it's a point where writers often give up. So that's a little bit where I want to focus attention here. I had an advisor in grad school who at some point wrote an evaluation letter, a recommendation letter for me that I didn't sign the thing saying I wouldn't read it. So I read it, which I'm not sure I would actually recommend in retrospect, but it was illuminating because one of the things she said, she wrote many nice things, but things she said is like, Marianne expects more praise than she has earned. And essentially, like that, to make it very succinct, she said it nicer and in more, like she was sort of saying that, like, I thought I was a hotshot writer and the potential was maybe there, but I hadn't done the work yet to actually put that on the page, right? And I was waiting for the accolades.
Which isn't a good place to start. It probably served you well that you were, in some ways, overconfident.
Right, but I think that, I'm really glad that I ended up doing a PhD because it forced me to slow down, and it gave me sort of the coursework structure, etc., that said, like, I was sort of told in this creative writing PhD, writing a book is going to take you years, and it's supposed to take you years, and it's supposed to take revision, and I needed to hear all of that. I think I needed to have that expectation reset so that I would not be totally crushed by the like, it's not brilliant immediately, right? And I think that, when we talk about revision, that movement to I often tell my students, like, when we critique your work in workshop, take the critiques, put the story away for a month. Right? Like, don't try to revise immediately. I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I can't see it clearly right away because I'm still caught up in the way I felt when I was drafting it, what was happening in my head. I can't see the criticisms clearly, none of it. So put it away for a month and then come back.
Yes.
and you're a different person in a different headspace. So I guess that's a little bit, I don't know, like seeing revision as a gift. I'm still working on it.
Well, I mean,
It's hard.
the thing is, yes, I agree with you 100%. That's what's hard, but that's why I'm bringing this up. That's why I'm talking about
Yeah.
it, is because
Yeah.
that's the cheese at the end of the tunnel. That's the reward. Of course it's hard.
Yeah.
Of course we just want praise. That's actually why I couldn't send out, that's mainly the reason I couldn't send out a 1,000-word first piece of a first draft before I'd finished anything to 30 people like you can, is because I really want praise, and either they'd praise it, in which case I'd be done because I got the praise, or they wouldn't praise it, in which case it'd be crushed because they're not praising it. Like, it would just emotionally confusing. Even if that's what I was saying before, intellectually I would probably know which pieces of feedback to use,
Right.
but it would be emotionally so confusing because I'm so hungry for praise. And it's my like not showing anything to anybody until I'm done with the first draft is a great effort because I really want the praise, but that's not good for me, right? It's like, it's like dessert first.
I want to throw in
Dessert first is not bad, but yes, go ahead.
an anecdote from Delaney that he has said that when a book of his comes out and it gets praise reviews, when the reviews are all super positive, he just sits there and basks in the praise and has no interest in doing any work for his next book. But if it's negative, then he says, "I'll show them." And
I'll show them and fire it up. You have to be very aware of that. But the reason I say revision is a gift is because that's reframing. Is like, it's maybe the praise is like, I'm totally hungry for the praise, but it's kind of a fool's errand. I don't have any control over it. I can tie myself into knots over it. Even when I get it, sometimes it's overwhelming and it's too much.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, sometimes when I get recognition, I'm like, I don't know what to do now. I have to, you know what I mean? Like, oh my God, the next thing better be even better. Oh my God, what am I going to do? That's overwhelming, right? And in some ways, being just left alone is far better. That's what I'm hungry for. But the thing I want to be hungry for is more that when I talk about the revision being a gift, it's like, what an opportunity to actually be better. Like, it's a distinctive thing that you can go back and you can put down the things you most care about, that scare you the most, that you're most in touch with, make all the mistakes because you're not perfect yet. You know what I mean? Because you're flawed, and a lot of like your toxic, like your internalized oppressions, you're also not internalized ways you oppress other people. All your bullshit comes out onto the page, and that's partly what we're afraid of. It's partly what I'm afraid of. So I'm going to be a dick or an ignoramus or callow or overly clever and self-indulgent. Like all of my worst features are there on the page, and it's painful. It's painful for everyone to see them. It's painful for me to admit that they're there. But like, it's also such an opportunity that I can then, it's like, it's not a roaring lion. It's a piece of paper sitting there that I can go with a pen and be like, maybe this word would be better. Oh, this is and it's really powerful.
I'm thinking about like, you talk about these insecurities that kind of like may stop you, get in the way, and so on. I'm thinking about my early writing career where I was writing erotica, right? And what I was writing was immensely taboo, right? And my parents had an arranged marriage in the village. Like, the distance between what I grew up with, I wasn't allowed to go to school dances, etc. And where I ended, and what I was writing about, which it's a little hard to put this in context today because things have changed so much. But in those days, it was very scandalous, right? It was, you couldn't. Their bookstores did not have erotica sections. You couldn't. You'd have to go to like a skanky men's sex toy store to buy this stuff, right? So I was writing these stories because I thought it was politically important to do so, and getting battered, right? Like, my parents were screaming at me. I was getting hate mail from guys in India who were angry that one of their women was writing about this. I had journalists yelling at me at parties that, like, wow. Oh yeah, it's one guy who said I had to be a nymphomaniac if I was willing to write about sex in public. And this was like at a Philly writers gathering kind of thing, right? Wow. So the world has changed, right? But it was this.
Well, in certain regards, I mean.
Well, but in
particular regard, but yes, but
in this regard, the world has changed, right? Like, no one is shocked anymore that you write about sex explicitly, whatever. in that way.
Well,
And
I more meant just the know-it-all man yelling at some brown woman at a cocktail party is not
sure,
genre.
sure. But I guess I sort of feel like it built up my spine.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So like there's
Yeah,
a
I
certain
do know what you mean.
connection between that and what you're talking about later, where I can like send out a story to 30 people and like the bluster of their opinion goes around me. Like in order to do the work I was doing at 20,
Yeah.
I had to be very, very confident in the worth of it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so for better or worse, I think that stayed with me, right? And I don't know, maybe
No, it's
this is
true. I
maybe
mean, it's
not a
weird to know the
relevant
cause or
thing, but
effect because you may have been
yeah,
like, did you learn it there, or were you even able to do it there because you already had it? Is a bit of a chicken and egg, but yeah, no, I agree, and I see that in
yeah,
you. That's what I find admirable about you being able to send it out to 30 people is that, and but I shall say also, I'm almost less sensitive to criticism than praise. It's almost worse. Like Jed
yeah,
is
yeah.
saying, probably the worst outcome is that everybody loves it, right? That's going to be the most confusing.
So that's weird to me. I'm not sure I really understand that. So please feel free to praise me. It's never going to make my writing worse. So, like, if you praise me, I'll go do more.
Please be sparing
So
with your praise. No, I mean, it's not so much. I don't know. That's an odd quirk of my psychology, but it can be. I think praise can
yeah,
be very confusing. It can be
no, and
very.
I see that in other people definitely.
It can be
So
Well,
very. Yeah. Go ahead.
and for some people, that level of criticism would completely destroy them and they would
Yeah.
never write anything again.
Yep.
yeah, I was, as I said, very stubborn.
Yeah.
So
But
okay,
that's
so
true, and that's also a thing, like in the context of Clarion. I mean, particularly the sort
yeah,
of harsher Clarion teachers who are like follow that Harlan Ellison, Samuel Delaney model of like this is my opinion about whether you're going to succeed. Like I think that can
Wait,
be very destructive. What's that?
did Chip do that?
well,
Marianne. It was Marianne's Clarion. That was
it was my Clarion. Maybe should we
Wow.
do a
at
segue into
every
that?
Clarion he does. Yeah.
Well, I want to be okay. Let me give everyone some context if you're listening to this. So Harlan Ellison was famous for coming to Clarion as one of the week-long instructors, and at the end of his week, going around the room and telling the students whether they were going to make it or not. You will, you won't, etc. Right? And I don't know what his justification was, but I would assume that he was like, I'm going to give you a fair evaluation from your instructor, right? When Samuel Delaney was teaching at my Clarion, and he came in and he told us about this, and he said that, and I preface this by saying that he was my hero. I wrote my bachelor's thesis on him. I went to Clarion because he was going to be teaching there. I was tremendously excited to learn from him. So here's my little idol saying he's going to do this. He said he was doing it because he taught in a program where students could go through 2 years of a master's in fine arts in writing and never get a real evaluation of their work. There was no like structural moment where that would happen. And as a result, they might go on and spend decades of their life trying to be writers when in his estimation, they had no chance of being successful, right? And it's interesting because if you frame it that way, certainly if someone was going to try and be, I don't know, like their ambition was to be an NBA player and their, high school basketball coach said, look, I'm sorry, like you're just not fast enough. You don't have the hands for it, etc. I think most people would be like, they're probably right. Like they can evaluate this and it's sort of a fixed thing that's unlikely to improve. Or someone who says to a ballet dancer, ballet is the way it is, and your body, when you hit puberty, has evolved in such a way that you would now have to change the entire field in order to be successful, right?
Right.
Which is not to say you can't do it, but
and if someone, and I think everyone would also say that if you were to say that to someone who wanted to be a cook or a computer programmer or a carpenter or a airline pilot or maybe eyesight or any of a number of professions, you would immediately see that as absurd.
right.
So you're never going to be a computer programmer. You just don't have the typing skill, whatever,
Right. Well, so that's the thing. So
Sure.
writing is in this like the arts are a little tricky, right, in that way, because there's certainly some aspects that are very skill-based or talent-based or whatever, where you can evaluate pieces of it. Like, I mean, as I said, I played classical piano for many years, and my piano teacher, in 8th grade was like, if you wanted to become a classical pianist, I think you could become a professional, essentially have the job he has, right? Perform some and teach a lot. And you'd need to start practicing 8 hours a day instead of 2 hours a day. And I was like, please do not tell my mother this is an option, right? Like, I have no interest in this. But like, there's he could evaluate my skills reasonably there. So I guess I'm saying I have more sympathy to what Delaney was trying to do than most people would.
I think a lot of people have sympathy with it. I mean, I think I'm probably an outlier, and I think a lot of it has to do with precisely what you're saying. What do you think writing is, and what do you think? And I also think it's partly a generational thing, because Harlan Ellison's day, when he was going in and saying, "You can make it, you can't," that was an actual professional path that you could just write short stories and sell them for 3 cents a word and make a living where you could support a family or not. And like, it was a pretty straightforward bar. You know what I mean? Like, he could probably tell if you could sell to the 4 markets that mattered. You know what I mean? Like, you can sell a lot to Analog, you could sell, or Astounding, and you can maybe even sell to the Saturday Evening Post and whatever. You know what I mean? Like, it was a narrow, small world. And now, like, it's sort of in the 21st century, it's sort of comical, because, like, do you know what I mean? Like on what criteria? Like, if the goal is to sell 50 Shades of Grey, would Delaney make the cut? You know what I mean? Like, really? Like, because apparently, what would he have said to himself? Like, the thing that made all 3 of us idolize Delaney. Delaney is a great writer. We adore him, right? Everybody is unified and united. I think the things that make Delaney so amazing and so worthy of all of our adoration are precisely the things that make it unlikely that make an instructor with Delaney's ideology ought to tell young Delaney that he can't make it as a writer.
Let me pause and say he didn't say that. So he modified it, right? He basically said, like, I can't possibly know whether you can make it as a writer. There's too many variables, blah 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 blah. I've only read 2 of your stories,
right?
So he said all these caveats, right? And he said, but I do want to give you some kind of valuation, and what I'm going to tell you is, and this is in some sense much more crushing, right? Is I'm going to give you 3 possibilities. I see something interesting in your work. I don't see anything interesting in your work. Or I see something interesting in your work, but it's blocked, and I'm not sure you're going to be able to work through it.
But in a way, the Harlan, you're right, it is more brutal and more irrelevant. Like, Harlan Ellison is literally saying, I know of this way of making money. I actually know, because there's only 5 venues, I actually know whether you can do that. So I'm just telling you whether you can make money. Delaney is saying, I live in a world in which there are 600 incompatible literary games that are being played today.
I know.
Some of those, at random, may generate enormous amounts of money, and some of them none at all.
I don't think
I'm not very good in the ones that generate the money.
I don't think he was talking about the money.
No,
I really think he was trying to offer an aesthetic judgment,
that makes it even more strange. Right? That makes it even more strange. It was like, can you, Harlan Ellison is saying, can you make a living at this? Delaney is saying, can you write something that Delaney will be interested in? Delaney is a wonderful writer, has a very weird set of tastes. If you go through a list of things Delaney's a fan of, it's a wonderfully odd and hodgepodge set of things. So again, I tell you, if you'll fit into this odd and hodgepodge set of things, it's an odd.
I understand that, but I mean,
get him on the show. We'll be nice to him. We'll be nice if you bring Delaney to the podcast. I'm not trying to. I love Delaney.
He's in the literary, artistic, aesthetic. That's his realm, and I personally appreciated his take on mine was that there was interesting but blocked. I was in that 3rd category, and I think it's accurate. I think it was like, at that point in my writing career, I had, like, in the stories he'd seen, there were good moments, there were, like, interesting things, but those stories were not fully developed versions of themselves even yet, much less interesting for the field as a whole. So anyway, I guess the question of whether a writing instructor should be giving aesthetic judgments like that, I mean, Delaney is also a critic, and so I think he's bringing his critical lens to it, and maybe it's not appropriate for a Clarion teacher. I could see that argument.
I think critical, but I mean that's the. My issue is not that it's a critical aesthetic judgment. I definitely think you should be making a critical aesthetic judgment. There's two issues. One is that making a critical aesthetic judgment of a work, which is in front of you, is different than making a critical judgment of a person on the basis of 2 stories they wrote in a rush.
Sure,
and the second thing is that making a critical aesthetic, it's probably more important thing, is like, what are you trying to achieve? This is what I see is in the way, is different from I find this interesting. It's like, that's great. I'd love to know. I mean, I would love to know if Delaney found something I wrote interesting. That would be great. I'd be very happy if he did. I'd be a little disappointed if he didn't. But sort of positioning that as like, and that's the golden ticket, if I find it interesting.
Yeah, I wouldn't do what he did. I guess I understand what he was trying to do, and I think anyway.
I would enter a class of 17 Clarion students, assuming that maybe 2 or 3 of them are at all close to my aesthetic project.
Yeah, I don't think he was framing it in that. I think he might now, if you had that conversation with him.
Sure.
That was not.
Well, it was many years ago, right? This was also 20 years ago.
The 30 years, I don't know, close to 30
years. A lot of years ago.
And I guess I would say, like, I do have moments now where I have to make aesthetic judgments, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to decide, is this, certainly any editor has to decide, like, am I going to buy this story, right?
Yeah, sure.
Am I going to put money down on this? I also have things that are more in the teaching vein about potential, where I'm asked to write recommendation letters all the time, right, for my students. And generally I say yes, but there's a complex moment there, because what happens if someone is asking you for a recommendation letter and you do not, your honest assessment of the work is that you can't write them a full-throated recommendation. What would you do in that position?
Yeah, that's a tough, right? Sure.
And I have said to a couple of people, I've said, I will write the letter if you want, but it's not going to be overwhelmingly enthusiastic, and you may want to ask somebody else to write your letter for you, right? And that's awful. It feels horrible to say that, but there is there's a kind of like, what is your responsibility to the field as a whole?
Well, I'm not suggesting that people should be insincere. I'm not suggesting, honestly, I have zero problem if somebody comes up to Delaney and says, by the way, if you don't mind my asking, do you think do you see anything interesting in my work?
It was probably not a good teaching moment for something that, we didn't necessarily.
Like, honestly, I might go up to Delaney and say, do you see anything interesting in my work? Like, that could happen. That's a real thing that could happen. But I guess what I'm saying,
we didn't all opt into it, etc.
Not even if he said, I think that he did actually, at least in later ones, maybe say you can opt out if you want or whatever. But like, it's more the framing. You know what I mean? Anyway, whatever. It's not very important. How do we get on
trying
this?
To say something,
Sorry,
I think.
Jed, go.
Did you want to?
I've been waffling about whether to say this. I think that I guess I want to make the point that one of the problems with telling writers what you think they will be capable of in the future is that you may just be wrong. And the reason that I say that is that one of my Clarion instructors, who I'm not going to name, but who is no longer with us, told one of the students what they thought of another of the students and said that they didn't think that other student was going to go anywhere. And it turned out that other student was the only one in our class who has done reasonably well in a writing career.
I would also suggest you're probably going to be wrong. If Jane Austen had a chance, if Jane Austen had a chance to tell Charlotte Bronte if she found anything interested in her work, she would have said no, and vice versa. Like, you know what I mean? Like, really? Like, anyway.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, like, that kind of judgment is super hard to make, right? I mean, I think writers make intuitive leaps that you can't predict, right? Like, just because even if you can look at their work and say, like, okay, what I'm reading right here is super pedestrian and imitative, and it's a bad copy of Tolkien, which I see a lot. I have no idea whether next month that student is going to let something emerge from their subconscious that, like, takes them in a completely different direction, right? And like all of this was just sort of preparatory, like running scales, essentially, right?
Well,
Uh,
go ahead.
no. I think like there are points in a professional career when you have to make evaluations because there are only so many slots, and that's the job you have as an editor selecting material or whatever is very different than the job of a instructor fostering writing talent and creativity and whatever else, right? Like so
that reminds me of something that I was thinking about earlier in terms of what it takes to do a revision and to think about revision. I think this is related. Sometimes all that a writer needs is just a little bit of a push, just being told, I think you should revise this. And what I'm thinking of in particular is Ellen Datlow was one of my Clarion instructors. And at one point she brought in a story in its original form and in its final form to show us something about editing. And unfortunately, this was not a great example of editing, but it was a great example of revision, because this was, I think it was a story by Pat Cadigan. And Ellen showed us the original story, and she showed us the revision letter that she'd sent, which essentially said, you should revise this. And Cadigan completely rewrote the story and transformed it from something that was kind of mediocre to something that was really good. And so I think that sometimes you don't really need, and we saw this a couple of times with Strange Horizon stories too. Sometimes you don't really need a detailed critique. Sometimes you just need a little nudge to.
I almost feel like I send Jed all my stuff and I make him read it and give me feedback. And now I'm like, you're saying this, and I'm like, oh, maybe you should just, as a default on everything I send you, right back, you should revise this.
You should revise this.
I mean, it could be better, and then that might achieve even better results. That's fascinating.
Maybe I'll try it next time.
No, I want you to praise it and tell me it's fabulous.
We could build you a bot, like a script, where you send the story and like
a response to all my
one out of every 6 times it says, this is amazing, you're the best thing. And then 5 out of 6 times it says, you should revise this, it could be better. And that's like all it does.
So this makes me want to say that sometimes it doesn't even take the nudge. This is one of my favorite stories about Strange Horizons editing, that one day Jo Walton sent us, this was early in her career, I think, sent us a 9,000 word fairy tale retelling. And before we could read it, like 5 hours later, she sent us another email, and it said, I was looking at this story and I realized that a lot of it was unnecessary. And so I cut the unnecessary parts, and she had trimmed it down to like 1,000 words. And we bought it. It was a great story.
Yeah.
But the original 9,000 word story was it needed some trimming. So sometimes you just need a little bit of distance.
Hello again, humans. If you have any thoughts about this episode or anything else about the show, please email us at mrahpodcast@speculativelyterature.org, or you could tweet with us at mrahpodcast. This podcast is hosted by Marianne Mohanraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum. Editing and show notes by Darius Vinisar. Music composed by Thor Bremer, and cover art by Stephanie Bailey. Thanks for tuning in to Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans.